What happens when a color becomes a confrontation? When a wall isn't just a wall, but a mirror held up to a system that demands silence, sameness, and submission? This isn't about paint. It's about power, and what happens when you dare to reclaim it? They told me this neighborhood was peaceful, that the HOA existed to preserve beauty, to maintain order, to protect property values. But no one warned me that behind every manicured lawn was a surveillance system dressed as civility. I moved here for quiet, for space, for the kind of life that doesn't demand explanation. But I quickly learned that in HOA territory, explanation is currency and difference is debt. My house wasn't loud. It wasn't broken. It wasn't offensive. It was just mine, a shade of muted teal, chosen not for rebellion but for resonance, for the way it caught the light in the morning and softened the shadows at dusk. But Karen didn't see resonance. She saw a deviation. She saw a threat. She saw something she couldn't control. And control, in HOA culture, is the highest virtue. She left notes, polite at first, then pointed. She quoted bylaws. She cited community standards. She spoke of visual cohesion, as if my house were a virus infecting the neighborhood's immune system. I tried to reason. I explained the color's history, its meaning to me, its compliance with the broader palette. But reason doesn't work on people who mistaken their preferences for principles. Karen didn't want understanding. She wanted obedience. And obedience, when demanded without dialogue, becomes tyranny. I attended meetings. I listened to speeches about preserving the character of the neighborhood. I watched as people nodded, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid to disagree. Because disagreement in spaces like these is punished with paperwork, fines, and isolation. I began to feel the walls closing in, not physically, but psychologically. Every glance from a neighbor felt like a measurement. Every walk past my own home felt like trespassing. And Karen stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, smile sharpened into a blade. She believed she was protecting something. But what she was really doing was erasing something. Erasing nuance. Erasing individuality. Erasing the quiet rebellion of color in a world that demands beige. I started documenting everything, not for revenge, but for clarity. Because clarity, when threatened, becomes survival. I read the bylaws. I studied the codes. I found the loopholes. And in those loopholes, I saw the cracks in the illusion that harmony means sameness, that beauty means conformity, that community means control. Karen didn't know that I had studied architecture. She didn't know that color, to me, wasn't decoration. It was language. And language, when suppressed, becomes resistance. I began to plan, not a protest, a statement, a reclamation. Because reclamation, when done with intention, becomes revolution. She thought she had won. She thought her notes, her meetings, her pressure had forced me into submission. But submission isn't silence. It's strategy. And strategy, when rooted in truth, becomes transformation. They gave me a deadline, a formal notice, stamped and signed, demanding that I repaint my house within 30 days to comply with community standards. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And commands, when issued without dialogue, become declarations of war. I stared at the letter for hours, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well. It wasn't about paint. It was about power. About who gets to decide what beauty looks like. About who gets to define the boundaries of belonging. Karen had won. Technically, she had used the system to force my hand. But forced hands don't always surrender. Sometimes they create. I could have chosen beige. I could have chosen taupe. I could have chosen the safe, sanctioned shades that line every street in this neighborhood like a palette of submission. But I didn't. I chose fire, not literal flames, but a color so bold, so unapologetic, so emotionally charged that it couldn't be ignored. A deep, iridescent crimson with undertones of copper and defiance. The kind of color that doesn't whisper. It roars. I spent days preparing. Not just the walls, but the moment. I documented everything. I filmed the process. I invited friends. I made it public, because public acts of reclamation become statements. And statements, when made with intention, become movements. Karen watched from across the street, her arms folded, her face tight with disbelief. She had expected compliance. She had expected erasure. She had expected me to disappear into the beige. But I didn't. I painted. I painted with music blasting, with laughter echoing, with Atlas lying peacefully beside me like a sentinel of truth. And with every stroke, I felt the weight of silence lifting. Neighbors walked by. Some stared. Some smiled. Some nodded. And in those nods, I saw a recognition, not of the color, but of the courage. Because courage, when visible, becomes contagious. Karen called the HOA. She filed complaints. She demanded inspections. But the color, though bold, was within the legal parameters. I had studied the codes. I had measured the limits. I had played their game and won, and winning, when done on your own terms, is the most powerful kind. The HOA was silent. They couldn't punish me. They couldn't find me. They couldn't erase me. And Karen, for all her fury, was powerless. She stopped walking past my house. She changed her route. She avoided eye contact, because confrontation, when met with truth, becomes retreat. I didn't gloat. I didn't taunt. I didn't escalate. I simply existed, loudly, vividly, unapologetically. And in that existence, I reclaimed something deeper than property. I reclaimed identity. I reclaimed voice. I reclaimed the right to define beauty on my own terms. The house became a landmark, not officially, but emotionally. People use it as a reference point. Turn left at the red house. You know, the one that stands out, and standing out in a world that demands blending in, is a form of resistance. I received messages, some angry, some admiring, some curious. I responded to all of them, not with defensiveness, but with dialogue, because dialogue, when rooted in truth, becomes transformation. Karen never spoke to me again, but she didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest admission, an admission that control, when confronted with creativity, collapses. And in that collapse, I found freedom. The paint dried, but the tension didn't. My house stood there, radiant, defiant, unmistakable, a rupture in the visual rhythm of the neighborhood, a challenge to the aesthetic orthodoxy that had long gone unquestioned. And the reactions came quickly, not in words at first, but in glances and pauses, in the way people slowed their steps as they passed, unsure whether to admire or recoil. Karen stopped walking past entirely. Her route changed overnight, as the proximity to color might infect her with dissent. But others lingered. Some stared with curiosity, some with quiet approval, and some with the kind of discomfort that reveals more about the viewer than the viewed. Because discomfort, when triggered by difference, is rarely about the thing itself. It's about the fear of what it represents. My house had become a mirror, not of me, but of them, of their assumptions, of their complicity, of their unspoken belief that sameness equals safety. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, not to punish me, they couldn't, but to reaffirm community values. The phrase echoed through the minutes like a prayer to a God that no longer answered. I attended silently. I watched them squirm, watched them try to reassert control, without admitting they'd lost it. Karen spoke briefly. Her voice was tight, her words rehearsed. She called the color aggressive, disruptive, unneighborly. But aggression, when projected onto pigment, reveals a deeper anxiety, the fear of losing narrative dominance. I responded once, calmly, clearly. I quoted the bylaws. I cited precedent. I reminded them that legality doesn't require approval, and approval, when weaponized, becomes oppression. The room was quiet, not because they agreed, but because they had no rebuttal. And in that silence, I felt the shift, not a revolution, a reckoning. Neighbors began to speak, not publicly, but privately. Notes appeared in my mailbox, some handwritten, some typed. Thank you. I didn't know we could do that. I've always hated the beige. One woman, elderly and soft-spoken, knocked on my door with a tray of cookies and said, "I painted my kitchen red last week." It felt like breathing. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of awakening. Because awakening, when sparked by visibility, spreads quietly. Karen doubled down. She filed more complaints. She tried to rally support. But support, when rooted in fear, crumbles under scrutiny. And scrutiny had arrived. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, was now under review. People asked for transparency, for reform, for representation. And representation, when demanded by those who've been silenced, becomes revolution. I didn't lead it. I didn't organize it. I simply existed. And existence, when unapologetic, becomes leadership. My house became a symbol, not a defiance, but a possibility. A reminder that rules can be challenged, that beauty can be redefined. That power, when confronted with truth, must adapt or dissolve. Karen stopped attending meetings. Her influence waned. Her voice, once dominant, became background noise. And the neighborhood, slowly, began to breathe differently. Not freely, not fully, but differently. The crimson walls stood firm, weathering sun and rain, watching the slow evolution of a community, learning to see. And seeing, once begun, cannot be undone. Color is never neutral. It speaks, even when we don't. It carries memory, emotion, defiance, and history. And in neighborhoods ruled by HOAs, color becomes a battleground, a proxy for control, a canvas for conformity, a mirror for fear. Karen didn't hate my house because it was red. She hated it because it refused to apologize, because it stood out, because it reminded her that not everything can be managed, muted, or made to match. And that reminder, for someone who's built her identity on order, is unbearable. I began to think about what color really means, not just in design, but in society. Red is always in the color of revolution, of urgency, of blood and fire and passion. It's the color that demands attention, that refuses to be background. And in a neighborhood where beige is a default, red is a declaration, a refusal, a challenge. I didn't choose it to provoke. I chose it to reclaim the space that had been quietly stolen by rules disguised as values, to reclaim the voice that had been drowned out by decorum, to reclaim the right to be seen. Karen's reaction wasn't just personal, it was archetypal. She represented every system that punishes difference, every institution that demands assimilation, every authority that confuses uniformity with unity. And my house, in its unapologetic hue, became the counter-narrative, a story told in pigment, a philosophy painted across wood and brick. Neighbors asked why I chose red, some genuinely curious, some quietly threatened. I told them the truth, because I was tired of disappearing, because I was tired of asking for permission to exist, because I wanted my home to reflect my truth, not their comfort. And truth, when made visible, becomes confrontation. I started reading more about color theory, about cultural symbolism, about how societies use aesthetics to enforce norms. I learned that in many cultures, red is a color of protection, of sacredness, of life. And I realized that my house wasn't just a protest. It was a sanctuary, a place where difference wasn't punished, but honored. Karen saw danger. I saw healing. She saw disruption. I saw expression. She saw rebellion. I saw restoration. And in that contrast, I saw the deeper truth, that fear of color is fear of self, of the parts we've been taught to hide, of the emotions we've been told to suppress, of the truths we've been conditioned to silence. My house became a meditation, a daily reminder that beauty is subjective, that control is fragile, that identity is sacred. I stopped seeing it as a structure. I started seeing it as a statement, a living, breathing embodiment of resistance. And resistance, when rooted in authenticity, becomes art. Karen couldn't understand that. She didn't have the language. But I did, and I used it in every brushstroke, in every conversation, in every refusal to repaint. Because repainting would mean retreat, and retreat after truth is betrayal. I chose red. I chose truth. I chose to be seen. And in that choice, I found something deeper than defiance. I found freedom. Karen's silence became louder than her complaints. After the repaint, after the meetings, after the neighborhood began to shift, her grip on the HOA began to loosen, not with drama, but with erosion. Influence, when built on fear, doesn't collapse in a single moment. It crumbles slowly, quietly, under the weight of truth. And truth had arrived, not as a speech, but as a color. My house stood firm, vivid, unapologetic. And every day it remained. It reminded people that control is not the same as leadership. Karen tried to rally support. She sent emails. She knocked on doors. She whispered warnings about decline, about property values, about precedent. But her words no longer landed, because fear, once exposed, loses its grip. Neighbors who had once nodded out of politeness now shrugged. Some ignored her, some challenged her, and some, quietly, began to question everything. The HOA board fractured. One member resigned, citing personal discomfort with recent events. Another proposed a review of enforcement policies. And another, someone I had never spoken to, sent me a message. We need to talk about change. Change didn't come easily. It never does. The bylaws were rigid. The culture was entrenched. The resistance was real. But resistance, when met with persistence, begins to bend. I attended more meetings. I spoke calmly, clearly, relentlessly. I proposed amendments. I shared stories. I brought data. And slowly, the board began to listen, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The community was watching now. And visibility, once achieved, becomes accountability. Karen's role diminished. Her voice, once dominant, became background noise. Her clipboard disappeared. Her presence faded. And in that fading, I saw the cost of unchecked power, isolation. She had built her identity on control. And when control collapsed, so did her relevance. But this wasn't about her anymore. It was about the system, about the way rules had been used to erase rather than include, about the way aesthetics had been weaponized against authenticity, about the way silence had been mistaken for peace. The HOA began to evolve. New members were elected. New policies were drafted. New conversations were held. And in those conversations, I saw something I hadn't seen before: possibility. Not perfection, not utopia, but possibility. The possibility of a neighborhood that doesn't punish difference. The possibility of a board that doesn't confuse authority with superiority. The possibility of a community that doesn't demand erasure in exchange for acceptance. My house remained red, not just as a color, but as a statement, a reminder, a monument to the moment when silence was broken. Karen still lives here. She walks her dog. She avoids eye contact. She doesn't speak. And that's fine, because this story was never about her voice. It was about mine. And mine, once reclaimed, cannot be silenced. The HOA changed. The neighborhood changed. I changed. And in that change, I found something deeper than victory. I found transformation. It started with a knock, not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from a neighbor I'd never spoken to, an older man named Victor, who had lived here for 20 years and never once attended a board meeting. He stood on my porch, hands in his pockets, eyes on the crimson walls behind me, and said, "I didn't know we were allowed to do that." That sentence lingered, not because it was profound, but because it was honest. And honesty, when spoken without agenda, becomes a doorway. Victor didn't want to argue. He wanted to understand. And understanding, when pursued without defensiveness, becomes transformation. We talked for an hour about color, about conformity, about the quiet pressure to blend in. He told me he'd always wanted to paint his shutters forest green, but was afraid of making waves. I told him waves are how shorelines change. And something shifted, not just in him, but in me, because dialogue, when rooted in vulnerability, becomes connection. More neighbors followed, some curious, some cautious, some quietly rebellious. They asked questions. They shared stories. They admitted fears. And in those admissions, I saw the architecture of a culture built on silence. A woman named Lena confessed she'd been fined for planting sunflowers instead of HOA-approved shrubs. A young couple revealed they'd been warned about their rainbow doormat. A teenager told me his pride flag had been torn down twice. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms. symptoms of a system that punishes visibility, that confuses order with morality, that mistakes control for care. And my house, my red, radiant, unapologetic house, had become the catalyst, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. Clarity, when sustained, becomes invitation. We started gathering, not formally, not politically, but intentionally. Backyard conversations, porch circles, late-night texts. We talked about what community could be if it wasn't built on fear, if it wasn't policed by aesthetics, if it wasn't dictated by a handful of people with clipboards and insecurities. Karen never joined. She watched from a distance, her silence now a kind of exile. But the rest of us spoke, and in speaking, we began to redefine what it meant to belong. Belonging, we realized, isn't about matching. It's about mattering, about being seen, heard, valued, not despite our differences, but because of them. The HOA noticed. They tried to reassert control. New memos, new reminders, new threats, but the tone had changed. People questioned. People pushed back. People demanded transparency. And transparency, when demanded collectively, becomes power. We proposed new policies, ones that protected expression, that honored diversity, that limited arbitrary enforcement. Some passed, some stalled, but the process had begun. And process, when rooted in truth, becomes progress. My house remained red. Victor painted his shutters green. Lena planted more sunflowers. The teenager hung his flag again, and the neighborhood, once beige and silent, began to bloom. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but authentically. Karen still walks her dog, still avoids eye contact, still clings to the illusion, but the illusion is broken. And in its place, a new story is being written, one conversation at a time. Reclamation isn't loud. It's deliberate. It's a slow, intentional act of taking back what was quietly stolen, not with rage, but with clarity. After the conversations, after the shifts, after the silence around Karen became permanent, I stood in front of my house and saw it differently, not as a battleground, not as a symbol, but as mine, fully, finally, unapologetically mine. The red walls no longer felt like defiance. They felt like truth. And truth, when lived without shame, becomes sanctuary. I began to reshape the space, not just physically, but emotionally. I planted wildflowers along the walkway, colors that clashed and danced and refused to be curated. I hung wind chimes that sang in unpredictable tones. I built a bench beneath the old oak tree and carved into it. Let them stare. And they did, but the stares had changed. They weren't hostile. They were curious, respectful, sometimes even admiring, because reclamation, when sustained, becomes inspiration. I started writing again, not just about the HOA, but about identity, about visibility, about the quiet violence of conformity. My words found readers. My story found resonance. And resonance, when shared, becomes movement. I was invited to speak at local events, to consult on inclusive design, to help draft new community guidelines, not because I had demanded it, but because I had embodied it. An embodiment, when rooted in truth, becomes leadership. I didn't seek power. I sought presence. And presence, when held with integrity, becomes influence. Karen never returned to the board. Her house remained beige, her blinds always drawn. But mine remained open, always, because openness is the antidote to fear. I hosted gatherings, not HOA meetings, but dinners, conversations, art nights. People came. They brought stories. They brought questions. They brought themselves. And in that bringing, we built something new, a community not of sameness, but of solidarity, not of rules, but of respect, not of silence, but of sound. Atlas lay beside me through it all, older now, slower, but still vigilant, still loyal, still the quiet heartbeat of my reclamation. I looked at him one evening as the sun turned the red walls into fire and whispered, "We did it." Not perfectly, not easily, but undeniably, I had reclaimed my space, my voice, my role, not as a rebel, not as a victim, but as a witness. a creator, a mirror. And in that mirror, the neighborhood saw itself, flawed, evolving, unfinished. Just like me, just like all of us. Reclamation isn't a moment, it's a practice. And I practice it every day, in every flower I plant, in every story I tell, in every refusal to disappear. Because disappearing is no longer an option. Not for me, not for Atlas, not for anyone who's ever been told to repaint their truth. This wasn't just a story about paint. It was a story about power, who holds it, who fears it, and who dares reclaim it. Karen thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but what she was really protecting was an illusion. The illusion that beauty must be quiet, that difference must be managed, that control is the same as care. And when that illusion cracked, what spilled out wasn't chaos. It was truth. My house didn't disrupt the neighborhood. It revealed it. It revealed the fragility of systems built on sameness. It revealed the violence hidden in politeness. It revealed the fear that lived beneath the surface of every rule written to erase rather than include. And once revealed, those truths demanded reckoning. I didn't set out to be a symbol. I set out to be myself. But in a world that punishes visibility, being yourself became the radical act. The red walls weren't just color. They were confrontation. They were clarity. They were the refusal to disappear. And in that refusal, I found others, people who had been silenced, erased, overlooked, people who had been told to repaint their truth. We built something, not a movement, not a rebellion, but a presence that doesn't ask for permission, a presence that doesn't apologize, a presence that doesn't fade. Karen still walks her dog, still avoids my house, still clings to the illusion, but the neighborhood has changed, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. The HOA has changed, the rules have changed, the conversations have changed, and I have changed. I no longer ask if I'm allowed. I no longer wonder if I'm too much. I no longer shrink to fit the frame, because the frame was never mine. And now I built my own, one painted in crimson, one rooted in truth, one open to anyone who refuses to disappear. This story isn't just mine. It's yours. It's anyone's who's ever been told to blend in, to be quiet, to repaint. And to you I say, don't. Don't repaint your truth. Don't shrink your voice. Don't apologize for being seen, because being seen is the beginning of change, of power, of beauty. And beauty, when defined by truth, is unstoppable.